This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hi, I'm Melissa Ray, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life, and I am joined today by Constance Duke, the Technical Practice Lead on our sustainability team. This week, we have two stories for you. One, temporary resolution on the Colorado River and where all the water is going. And Science Based Targets for Nature releases its first ever corporate standard for science based targets. All right, Constance, you want to kick it off with the Colorado River?
Yeah, sure. So you'll recall back in April, we actually talked about on one of these episodes about the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation weighing options for future Colorado River water withdrawals after those impacted states just failed to come to an agreement. And this week, the New York Times reported that an agreement had been reached, temporary, as you said. And you'll recall that one of the options that Secretary Holland considered at the time was cutting water use by 2 million acre feet, which is about 650 billion gallons of water per year, and kind of just spread that out across the states. The actual agreed upon cuts are actually much smaller. It's 3 million acre feet over 3.5 years, but it's still among the most drastic reductions ever taken in those states.
Okay, so we're saying the agreed upon. Does that mean that these are voluntary reductions? And why would the government agree to lower those cuts?
Yeah, good questions. Well, the federal government still has to sign off on this agreement. But the reduced cuts are only on the table because we just had this record rainfall in those states over the winter. So they can be a little bit more flexible. Only about 700,000 acre feet in cuts are voluntary, but the rest are
Mm.
tied to federal grant payments of $1.2 billion that are coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. And that money will go to tribal communities, irrigation districts, and cities that have agreed to reduce residential and industrial and agricultural water use.
Oh, okay. And isn't so okay, that sounds like a lot of municipal and residential,
Mhm.
but isn't most of that water used by agriculture?
Yeah, resounding yes. And it's not that we don't want to encourage people to conserve water at home. It's always a good practice, definitely take out your lawns, plant natives. But residential water use comprises 12% of Colorado River water use compared to 79% for agriculture. And the kicker here is that 55%, more than a trillion gallons per year, go towards livestock feed for the meat and dairy industry. So other crops like, stuff we eat or wear, like wheat, barley, cotton, and so on, comprise about 24% of agricultural water use. So that means your dinner choices are far more impactful than shortening your shower, which is still good, or removing your lawns, which is also great.
It's actually so important to remember that. It's not the obvious things of how you may think of consuming water, but all of that embedded water use in other activities and decisions. Yeah.
Exactly.
And isn't there an argument for needing more land to grow human food crops if we reduce land use for growing animal feed?
Yeah, that is a really common kind of thought process, but if we're assuming that there's no change in the efficiency of how we grow crops, we would still reduce land use by about 75%. And that's because when animals eat plants and then humans eat those animals, the caloric output is actually much smaller than if we just ate the plants directly. There's one stat I found that said that livestock takes up 80% of agricultural land globally, but produces only 20% of the population's caloric intake. So, quite a drastic difference. And in terms of water use, obviously, that would hugely reduce the amount we'd need to withdraw for crop irrigation.
Yeah, that's pretty astounding when you actually think of that. It's kind of like that, like we said, like that hidden embodied water use and just like so inefficient calorically. And when you think systematically about how to
Mhm.
best use the land and use the water, it's such a wasteful system in having that bite of steak.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, are there specific actions that businesses should take with regard to water conservation?
Yeah, and you just touched on that. I'd say the most important one is to abandon this mental model of water just being this cheap, abundant resource, kind of the way we've thought about it forever. It's such a precious resource. And, the whole water is life slogan. That's not a joke. It really is what our lives depend on. And I think if you approach all of your water consuming activities at home or at work with that in mind, it's easier to just kind of constantly think about, where's water wasted? Where can we apply technology to eliminate the waste? Where do we need to change behavior? And where does it make sense to support public policy for water conservation and equitable water access?
Yep. Absolutely. Well, we all know water is such a precious resource. And actually, the next story that I wanted to talk about this week is also has some water related to it. The science-based targets for nature and its first corporate standard. So this is actually kind of a unique thematic episode for us because there's no carbon here. We are always talking about carbon. We love carbon, but for anyone who's watching and listening who's sick of carbon tunnel vision, we have great news because we're not going to talk about it on this episode. So let's get into the science based targets for nature and this new standard. The Science Based Targets Network, SBTN, is a collaboration of around 80 organizations that was established with the primary goal of helping businesses to operate within the Earth's ecological limits. And as we know, that means more than just carbon. That means land, that means water, the ecological services that we depend on as a global community and as a business community. And so this network has now released its first ever corporate standard for science based targets for nature. And the standard guides companies in how to assess and prioritize their environmental impacts across various land and water criteria. And it's providing methods on how to set targets that are based in science in order to then address those issues. And so, for those that were actually tuned into our webinar last week, which shameless plug, Constance did a fabulous job. But on our new science based target initiative aligned with carbon targets and target setting, imagine a similar process, but anchored in topics of water and land. So, this is things like freshwater quality and quantity, protection and preservation of terrestrial ecosystems, and then targets for biodiversity and targets for ocean, just to give a little bit of a sense.
Yeah, this is so great. I mean, we're finally seeing progress on nature and biodiversity. And it's something I think that most of us in the sustainability risk reporting and the target setting space have been rooting for a really long time. And last March at COP15 in Montreal, not to be confused with the climate COPs, where we are on number 28, global governments did adopt this biodiversity framework with a set of goals aimed at ending biodiversity loss and protecting natural ecosystems and ramping up funding, very importantly, for biodiversity projects. And we actually talked about this biodiversity COP in a previous week in sustainability months ago, right?
I know. I love when, and same with the Colorado River story, actually, from
Yeah.
above. It's like these are not one and done news stories. These are, longer stories with evolutions and, and always to be continued. But you're absolutely right. So over the past several years, both businesses and governments have been increasingly focused on nature and biodiversity, specifically from a risk perspective. So companies have been facing a lot of pressure from investors to assess and report on their nature and biodiversity related issues. And there's a new disclosure system out. It may not be new to those on the line that are familiar, but the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature Related Financial Disclosure, that's currently in drafted edition and expected to finalize by end of year. And then actually just this past September, you had the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB of the IFRS org, and their announcement to add requirements for companies to include more transparency on the impacts of and risks related to nature and ecosystems in its climate related disclosure standard. And that has a particular focus on TNFD. So these things are kind of all interplaying quite nicely together. And what I think is actually important to note about those two, TNFD as well as the ISSB inclusion, is that they're taking a focus of single materiality, right? Based off of financial materiality. So while the Science Based Targets Network is about the intrinsic value of, setting targets to make sure we are physically preserving and maintaining these systems, these other standards aren't frankly about the intrinsic value of doing good for good, but are actually indicative of this real investor driven pressure to understand the financial materiality and risks and opportunities related to nature and biodiversity, because they are systems that many businesses and, as we know, supply chains depend on for stability and affordability in the products and services that companies make and sell and we consume as people.
Yeah, absolutely. And these standards and bodies, if they sound familiar, well, they should, not at least because we have been talking about them a lot. But essentially, we're seeing, nature and biodiversity following in the footsteps of how we're approaching emissions. So TNFD being the cousin of TCFD, which came out in 2017, and then ISSB of the IFRS org, which is releasing the IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 disclosure standards that you also may have heard about. I'll just plug the webinar again because you can find it on our Sustain.Life YouTube channel. And we talked about how SBTI inspired SBTN to do something similar. And then it's really encouraging to see nature and biodiversity reporting and target setting aligned with our approach to emissions, which of course makes sense since they're inextricably linked.
Absolutely. And they also, not only are they linked, but having the same like systematic formulaic approach of how you think about things and assess things and methodologies just provides a lot of clarity and cohesion in this ever evolving world of climate, nature, and
Mhm.
biodiversity, just kind of operations and mindset. So it's still early days for SBTN. Right now, they're in pilot mode. And so there's 17 companies that are in the current pilot. And as often is the case with new sustainability standards, this first group of users, it's some of the world's largest companies that, yes, have leading sustainability programs, but also business models and products that both rely significantly on those ecosystems and ecological services and have significant impact on them. And that includes companies like AB InBev, Nestle, H&M Group, LVMH. So a couple of name drops, and just really excited to see what comes out of this. I'm sure there'll be some iterations and lesson learned, and we're certainly keeping a close eye on what's going on there.
Another follow-up segment to come.
Absolutely. All right. So that's what we have. And we will see you next week for more stories in sustainability.
Sustain.Life is a sustainability management SaaS platform with deep carbon expertise that helps future-proof small and medium-sized enterprises by taking climate action. Go to Sustain.Life to learn more. Thanks for listening and watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next week.